In the final moments of his life, 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez was lying on the floor of his family's apartment, broken, bruised, and gasping for air. Outside, the world carried on. Cars passed, televisions hummed, and no one knew that just a few walls away, a child was dying in silence. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe and like for more real crime stories that reveal the truth and give a voice to the victims. This was not the work of a stranger. It was done by the two people who were supposed to love him most. And one of them was Isauro Aguirre. To understand how an ordinary man could become the face of such unimaginable cruelty, we have to look closer at who he was before the world knew his name. Who was Isauro Aguirre? Isauro Tony Aguirre was born on June 13, 1980 in California. By all accounts, he lived a quiet and modest life. He wasn't famous, wealthy, or known for trouble. In fact, most people who knew him in his early years described him as kind. He worked as a caregiver in a retirement home, a job that demanded patience and compassion. Co-workers said he would go out of his way to help the elderly residents, often staying after hours to make sure they were comfortable. Later, he took a job as a security guard, tall, broad-shouldered, always polite. Neighbors remembered a man who smiled, nodded hello, and kept to himself. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker was waiting. A need for control, a temper that grew in silence, and a cruelty that no one saw coming until it was too late. That darkness would find its focus when he met Gabriel Fernandez, and when a little boy named Gabriel entered their lives. But beneath that calm exterior, something darker was taking shape. A quiet instability that number one around him seemed to notice. That darkness would find its spark in 2012 when Isauro Aguirre met Gabriel Fernandez. Pearl's life had always been difficult, filled with instability, poverty, and anger. Friends described their relationship as fast, intense, and at times volatile. At first, to outsiders, they looked like a normal couple, two people trying to make life work in a small apartment in Palmdale, California. But behind those thin walls, a storm was building. Isauro, once described as gentle, began to change. He grew controlling, suspicious, easily angered, and obsessed with dominance. And Pearl, she seemed to feed that darkness. Together they created an environment of fear, one that would soon revolve around a little boy who had just been brought into their home. His name was Gabriel Fernandez, Pearl's youngest son, a child full of curiosity, with a quiet smile and a heart that still believed in love. When Gabriel first came to live with them, it was supposed to be a fresh start, a mother reclaiming her child after years apart. But instead, it became the beginning of a nightmare. At first, the signs were small, bruises explained away as accidents, stories that didn't quite add up. Teachers noticed changes in Gabriel's behavior. He grew quieter, nervous. Sometimes he flinched when adults came near. No one knew yet that behind that apartment door, the abuse had already begun. And each passing day it grew worse, methodical, deliberate, and unimaginably cruel. This was not just punishment, it was torture. In the months that followed, the signs became impossible to ignore. Teachers noticed fresh bruises nearly every week, purple marks across Gabriel's face, welts on his wrists, burns on his scalp. Each time they asked questions. Each time Gabriel had an answer that didn't make sense. He told one teacher that his mother shot him with a BB gun. Another day he whispered that he didn't sleep in a bed, that he slept in a small cupboard, tied up so he wouldn't steal food. The teachers did what they were supposed to do. They filed reports, they called social services, but each call seemed to disappear into the void. Caseworkers visited the apartment, but Isauro and Pearl always had explanations: accidents, rough play, misunderstandings. They smiled, answered politely, and the case was closed. It happened again and again. 8 separate reports were made. 8 missed chances to save Gabriel's life. Behind closed doors, the violence escalated. When he flinched, they hit him harder, The walls of that apartment became a prison, one filled with the sound of suffering, muffled by fear and ignored by the system. And yet, even through all of it, Gabriel still tried to go to school. He still smiled at his teacher. He still drew pictures of his family, small stick figures holding hands under a yellow sun. But by the spring of 2013, Gabriel's small body was giving out. He was covered in bruises, burns and scars, and still no one stopped it. Every warning was missed. It was the night of May 22, 2013, in Palmdale, California. The apartment was silent, except for the faint hum of a television left on in the corner. Gabriel was in his room, if it could be called that, a small, dark space, a cabinet where he had been forced to sleep for days. That evening, the violence reached its peak. Isauro Aguirre, a man nearly 6 feet 4 inches tall and weighing over 200 pounds, unleashed his rage once again. He slammed the boy's head against the wall. He struck him with a bat, with a belt, with whatever he could grab. Each blow echoed through the thin apartment walls, but no one came. No one stopped it. When it was over, Gabriel's small body was broken, ribs shattered, skull fractured, teeth knocked out. He was bleeding internally, drifting in and out of consciousness. Gabriel Fernandez called 911. Her voice was calm, detached. She said her son wasn't breathing. When paramedics arrived, they found Gabriel naked, bruised and unresponsive. He was rushed to Antelope Valley Hospital, where doctors worked frantically to save him, but the injuries were too severe. 2 days later, on May 24, 2013, Gabriel Fernandez was pronounced dead. He was 8 years old. Doctors who treated him couldn't hold back their tears. Even seasoned emergency staff said they had never seen such cruelty inflicted on a child. His body told a story of long-term torture, broken bones in different stages of healing, burns, BB gun wounds, and scars that covered almost every inch of his skin. For the officers on scene, one question echoed louder than all the rest. How could anyone do this? That question would become the center of one of the most disturbing trials California had ever seen. When detectives from the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department arrived at the apartment, the scene told them everything they needed to know. Blood on the walls, stains on the carpet, a belt, a BB gun, and broken household items scattered across the floor. Nothing about that space looked like a home. It looked like a place where pain lived. As investigators began their work, the truth unfolded piece by piece. They interviewed neighbors, teachers, and social workers, the same people who had tried to raise the alarm. Each story matched the others, forming a timeline of horror that stretched back months. Detectives discovered that Gabriel had been locked in a small cabinet, a box hardly big enough for a child to lie down in. He was starved, beaten, and shot with a BB gun, often while gagged or tied up. The abuse was systematic, almost ritualistic, and every act pointed back to Isauro Aguirre. When officers questioned him, Aguirre appeared calm. He admitted to hitting Gabriel but called it discipline. He claimed he never meant to hurt him, yet the evidence said otherwise. There were bite marks, cigarette burns, and deep bruising consistent with long-term torture. Detectives described Aguirre's demeanor as chilling. Not emotional, not angry, just empty. No remorse, no fear, no urgency to know whether the boy had survived. As they pieced the case together, one question haunted every investigator. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How could so many reports, so many cries for help, fall through the cracks? The investigation would eventually expose failures in multiple agencies, a chain of missed opportunities that ended with the death of a child. By the end of that summer, the evidence was undeniable. Photographs, medical reports, and witness testimony painted a portrait of unimaginable cruelty. The case against Isauro Aguirre was airtight, and for detectives who had spent their careers confronting violence, this one stayed with them, because it wasn't just a crime, it was the deliberate destruction of innocence. In the early hours after Gabriel's death, detectives moved quickly. They had seen enough. The bruises, the burns, the fractured bones, They told the story no one wanted to believe. Isauro Aguirre and Gabriel Fernandez were taken into custody that same day. The two sat in separate interrogation rooms, quiet, expressionless, almost detached from what had just happened. Investigators noted how calm Aguirre appeared. He didn't ask about Gabriel's condition, he didn't cry, he didn't even look confused. He simply sat there, speaking in a low voice, describing what he called discipline, but every word was hollow. The evidence told the real story. Gabriel hadn't been disciplined, he had been tortured. When news of the arrest reached the public, outrage spread across California. Reporters called it one of the most horrifying child abuse cases in state history. The streets outside the courthouse filled with people carrying candles, photos, and signs that read, "Justice for Gabriel." Neighbors who had heard strange noises but stayed silent struggled with guilt. And social workers who had visited that apartment now faced questions they couldn't answer. How had so many failed one little boy? By the time Aguirre was transferred to Los Angeles County Jail, the entire nation knew his name. He wasn't just another inmate. As he awaited trial, Gabriel's story began to take on a life of its own. Not just as a crime, but as a question that lingered in every heart that heard it. How could anyone look at an innocent child and see something to destroy? In 2017, 4 years after Gabriel's death, Isauro Aguirre finally stood trial. The courtroom was silent as jurors were shown the photographs, the bruises, the burns, the medical scans of a shattered skull. Witnesses described Aguirre as calm during testimony, expressionless, almost detached, as though the words being spoken were about someone else. He rarely looked up, even as prosecutors recounted the torture in chilling detail. The evidence was overwhelming. Medical experts explained that Gabriel's injuries weren't the result of a single night of violence, but months of systematic abuse. And jurors listened, some crying openly as they heard how Gabriel had been forced to eat cat feces, shot with a BB gun and locked away in darkness. After weeks of testimony, the verdict was read. Guilty of first-degree murder with the special circumstance of torture. The courtroom held its breath as the judge pronounced the sentence, death. In that moment, justice felt heavy. Not triumphant, not satisfying, just heavy, because no sentence could undo what had been done. Aguirre was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, where California houses its death row inmates. Inside those concrete walls, surrounded by men condemned for the most violent crimes, Aguirre blended into the silence. He spends 23 hours a day in a small cell, 1 meal at a time, 1 hour of light each day. But despite the death sentence, California's moratorium on executions means that his fate remains uncertain. He may live out the rest of his life behind bars, under the shadow of a punishment that will likely never come. Outside the prison, the story continued to echo. Documentaries, vigils, and public campaigns demanded reform. People wanted accountability, not just for Aguirre and Pearl, but for every official who missed the signs. Because in the end, Gabriel's death wasn't just about one man's cruelty. It was about a system that failed to protect the most innocent among us. In the years since Gabriel's death, his story has refused to fade. It lingers, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in quiet conversations between parents and teachers who now look closer, listen longer, and refuse to stay silent. Gabriel became more than a name in a headline. He became a symbol of every child who has ever been unheard, unseen, or unloved. His face, with that shy smile and bright eyes, became a reminder of how fragile trust can be and how much it costs when it's broken. Isauro Aguirre still sits on death row at San Quentin State Prison. The walls around him are thick, the air cold, and the silence unbroken. No crowd waits outside his cell, no one calls his name. Only time and the weight of what he did remain. But beyond those prison gates, Gabriel's story has sparked something that might one day save another child. It forced California and the world to confront a painful truth that protecting children means listening the first time they whisper for help. And maybe that's where redemption lives. not in the punishment of a monster, but in the courage to make sure it never happens again. 8-year-old Gabriel Fernandez will never grow up, never laugh again, never live the life he deserved. But in remembering him, we keep his voice alive. And perhaps, in some small way, we make sure that no other child has to suffer the way he did. If this story moved you, if Gabriel's memory stirred something in you, subscribe to the channel, share this video, and help keep his story alive.